it's important to know who your adversary is so that you can evolve, right? And if you're doing security without sort of recognizing who they are, you're just building walls and the adversary could have planes, right? You have to think about who's coming and how they operate.
This is KBcast.
Are they completely
As a
cybersecure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is
as used to
security and
point
testing
out,
and performance and scalability
Risk and
all that?
compliance.
We can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me now in person is John Hultquist, Chief Analyst at Google Threat Intelligence Group, and today we're discussing John's view on Australia's threat landscape. So John, thanks for joining me and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so you know what? When I say the word threat landscape, and it's really interesting, and I mean, you would obviously know a lot more about this than I would, but it changes all the time, especially in my role in media. Like the amount of things that we're seeing that come through our desk and how things are changing in terms of the velocity and the speed in which it does change. So I want to sort of start there, given your background, given your role, walk us through your thoughts and insights around the threat landscape. Maybe start with globally, and then let's sort of then hone in on Australia.
Sure. I think you said velocity or, like the rate of change. I think that's been a big thing I've had to get used to through my career. I remember when I first started doing this, I could remember just about every major incident or case and now there's so many more actors than there used to be. And it is a lot harder to keep track of. But the things that really sort of change or cause all that change are technology's constantly changing, right? I think obviously we've entered this age of AI is going to create a lot of change. Geopolitics are constantly changing, and the adversary is constantly changing. One of the things I think that we're concerned about when it comes to the threat actors from China, for instance, is that they have evolved. We've come up with a lot of good solutions to sort of deal with their activity, and so they've gotten better. And they've come up with a new product. They've created new issues. Australia, I think the threats that I tend to talk about when I talk about Australia that stand out the most to me, I think are probably those threats from state actors out of China, as well as the criminal threat, which everybody faces. But Australia's had obviously some very recent incidents that sort of demonstrate the seriousness of that threat. And last time I was in the country too, I was talking about the threat of these North Korean IT workers, which is something that hasn't entirely gone away yet. And it's pretty serious.
So you mentioned before when you sort of started your career in terms of like where it is now, and it's very, very hard to keep up. You're right, because things are happening each day. So would you say people are just tired? Like, oh, it's just this. If it's not that, like even like I said, even from our perspective, it's hard to cover everything, right? We just don't have enough time in the day.
Yeah.
So how do people really feel at the end of the day once they've done, all of the things they need to do at work, and then there's like, oh, now there's another thing. Like, how do you think generally people are feeling?
Yeah, a lot of people are probably feel pretty beleaguered. Unfortunately, there are people that sort of compare our field to safety sometimes, right? And I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn from the safety profession. But the biggest difference between us and the safety profession is safety people are really facing off with the immutable laws of physics. The threats that we're dealing with change every day. And so unfortunately, we're essentially on a treadmill, right? We never get to get off of. And any solution, that we create, while it might mitigate some problem, there's always the actor will change and the problem, new threats will arise, and we'll have to deal with those as well. That could be rough.
This is so interesting. Okay, so and then I know that we've obviously spoken a lot about the global and then Australia more specifically, and you mentioned before like the state actors out of China, etc. But now there's a lot of these other sort of smaller breaches happening in terms of they are state actors per se, but we've heard a lot about scattered spider, which has been
Sure.
discussed a lot in the industry, for example, as it pertains to the recent Qantas breach. So
Sure.
maybe walk us through what's happening here then.
Well, really strange phenomena. So most of these cyber criminal activity that we see, or a lot of the cyber criminal activity, there's different types of it, but a lot of the really scaled cyber criminal activity comes out of Russian speaking countries, particularly Russia, but we've seen some stuff out of Ukraine and other places as well. It's comes out of essentially the underground, right? There's a marketplace where all these actors interact and they sell services to each other. And an intrusion, the average ransomware incident, for instance, is actually a series of transactions in this Russian speaking marketplace. But one of the strange phenomena that we've seen in the last few years is this rise of English speaking criminals. And they basically came out of a group of kids that were largely sort of organizing after COVID hit. They kind of dove into an online world, and they were doing some criminal activity. They were doing some just highly unethical, very aggressive, nasty activity like squatting and things like that. And out of these sorts of spaces, we started seeing real serious criminal threats arise. Sort of cells like scattered spider started to grow, where groups of these kids were starting to actually really get I would almost say competitive capability together. And those actors have really demonstrated some flaws in our security.
So when you say kids, what sort of age range are you talking? Because I mean, like as older people, like anyone sort of feels like a kid nowadays. But like, how young are we sort of talking here?
Well, I would say late teens, 17s to early 20s, and maybe even younger than that. But many of them, many of them are minors. They know that by doing this activity while they're minors, that they probably not going to face the same consequences. It appears many of them have probably been arrested and then rearrested, meaning that they don't seem to actually be very concerned about the consequences. And I think, the fact that they're young may be why they're so incredibly aggressive, because it may not have the same risk management concerns that you would expect from an adult, right? There's a reason why we don't let kids do some of the more dangerous activities, because they don't think the same way.
Yeah, okay, so this is interesting. So going back to Scattered Spider then from moments, my understanding is they're a bit more financially motivated, the younger kids, you know. So in terms of their motivation, obviously it's financial for sure, but are we going to start to see more of these groups propagate? Because as you mentioned, if they're minors, it's hard to be held accountable or there's not a lot of repercussions. It can be easy money for these people. I mean, I was listening to something a while ago about a guy who was living in the United States and then he was really desperate to pay his car repayment off and someone said, "Oh, you steal these credit cards." And he did all of this back in like the 80s or something, right? But he said it was
Mhm.
just too easy. So because it's so easy to get into, you don't have to leave your house. Are we going to start to see more of a rise of this type of criminal activity? I mean, no one's going nowadays, with a sack on their back to rob a bank anymore. Can they just do it from their home?
I think that within this community, that's exactly what we are seeing. These actors are sort of feeding their egos by sharing their exploits with each other, and that probably is only going to cause more and more people to get into the business. And I also think that there's even maybe some recruiting that's going on here, and we've definitely seen reports of that, based on the fact that that minors are at less risk, right? And so that if you want to do some of this stuff, you may want to actually bring other people in to help. And so, yeah, I think this is a problem that could be growing.
Okay, so then in terms of, so we got the group, so like state sponsored, a nation state, you've got the site, scattered spider that are obviously driven financially. If you had to sort of weight it, where do you sort of see that weight being distributed in terms of these groups?
That's a good question. So every organization sort of has a different profile, right? And so it's not the same for everyone. If you are in the defense industry, for instance, your major concern is going to be state actors. The average defense organization gets targeted by multiple states simultaneously. And then from those states, multiple teams. If you are in some of the, more traditional enterprises, particularly like say like retail, for instance, your major concern is probably going to be criminal activity, right? And if you could break that down too, your major concern may not be disruption from ransomware. It may actually be effects on your brand. One of the things that criminals learned a few years ago when they started leaking data is that the companies are way more concerned about brand than they are disruption. And we can see that play out in the activity that they carry out. We know that it takes about 2 days usually for a threat actor to get get in place to carry out or to deploy ransomware. It takes about a week for them to steal enough data for leaking. But they're willing to put in that extra 5 days because they know that it's way more likely that they'll get paid if they do.
So would you say, and I mean, even working in the field myself historically, before doing the media side of it, I mean, we were sort of saying more than 10 years ago, like a lot of it historically wasn't driven by financial. So would you start to see now, given what you do day to day, will that start to overtake now? Because, obviously with how the world is and, geopolitics, things are rising, the cost of living, are we going to start to see this become maybe the key driver leading the way in terms of these criminal groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the issues that we've got a problem with here is that it's very difficult to disrupt this, right? It's a lot of it's coming out of Russia. For instance, these actors aren't going to quit anytime soon. They're not going to go to jail. So I mentioned this marketplace, right? This underground marketplace. Well, if your incident is 3 separate players working together, it's somebody who got access to your organization, who sold that access to an intrusion group, and that intrusion group brought in a ransomware service, and any one of those goes down at some point, they've got an entire marketplace of replacements. And so it's very difficult to push back on a marketplace. And so we're sort of facing a problem that is structurally resilient. That's not very, very good news. You mentioned that, in the past, this wasn't as big a problem. And I'll tell you, as somebody who has sort of, sold intelligence or an intelligence product, the people that really only cared about criminal intelligence or cybercrime intelligence were banks and retail. And the reason they cared about that is because those actors were really only focused on fraud. What's changed, though, is that suddenly they found a new way to monetize. Instead of selling little, records for fractions of a cent, they can ask directly for cryptocurrency, right? And now, so the whole game for them now is, what do I have to do to a target until they pay me in cryptocurrency? And that could be ransomware. It could be leaking. It could be threatening a CEO's family. That's the world that we're living in now.
So you mentioned before disrupt it. Do you mean as in to sort of combat it? Like is it just going to start spiraling out of control?
The worst examples that I can think of is right around the time of COVID, a lot of these actors came forward willingly and said, hey, we're not monsters. We're not going to target healthcare in the middle of COVID, right? And they said that's too far. 1 or 2 did it anyway. They didn't care. But since that's happened, we've seen so many actors go back to targeting healthcare. There's already evidence that people are getting hurt and potentially dying because of these disruptive attacks. If these continue, critical infrastructure is going to go down. More and more people are going to get hurt. We could say that it's already spiraling out of control.
Okay, so going back to the healthcare, so you mentioned, no, we're not going to do that, we're not monsters, but then it happened. So then what was the motivation then for that?
Great question. So here's what's interesting when it comes to, particularly with ransomware, disrupting systems, is it takes time for an actor to get into an organization and get in place to deploy ransomware, like 2 days usually. If I put in all that time, I'm going to get paid, right? And the best way to ensure that you get paid is to pick a target who's going to pay, right? There are some organizations who just don't care, and they will slowly get back online and they'll live with that. But hospitals need those systems now, and they can get sued. That people's lives are on the line. They're ethically and financially and legally required to stay online. And that means they'll probably pay out. And the adversary knows that. And so they're going to target hospitals.
If you're in legal, risk, or compliance, you know the stakes and the spreadsheet sprawl. Vanta makes life easier by automating key parts of your security frameworks, from evidence collection to audit readiness. ISO 27001, SOC 2, GDPR. It's all in one platform, built to reduce manual work without cutting corners. Visit vanta.com/KBcast. That's VANTA.com/KBcast to learn more. So then they're saying they're not monsters, but then they are because
Yeah,
I
they
mean,
really are.
in the last few days, I've actually been at a hospital. Like my grandmother is really sick and has now passed away recently, last few days. But I was sitting there and I thought, imagine if something happened, how critical that would be. And that's me as a granddaughter, but that's also me as a cyber person, right? Like I don't know if sometimes we as cyber people really get on the front line and go into these hospitals and go, imagine if something happened. These people could die. That is a lot. I mean, I worked in a bank in cybersecurity. I mean, I've spoken about this. You're going to get your money back, but you
Yeah.
can't get your grandmother back if something of this caliber were to happen.
The scenario is really simple. To the concern we had, for instance, during COVID, wasn't that, that they were going to, break something irretrievably, or, that we couldn't get something back online. The concern we had was that, especially during COVID, every second counted because the system was already overloaded, right? And when that happens, essentially what you rely on is your ability to efficiently administer that healthcare system, right? And that is all done through, and if that IT goes away, you can't efficiently administer things. People can't get drugs in time. They can't get treatment in time. People are left out in the waiting room for too long, and you have a really dangerous situation. If you think about it as sort of like the target is your ability to efficiently administer and what happens when those things break, you can sort of draw that out to other problems, right? There are, I think, historically, the disruptive targets that have really been successful for a lot of organizations, or for a lot of criminals and state actors, have been things like logistics. It wasn't necessarily that those things aren't going to get where they needed to go eventually. It's that they couldn't get there in time, or the system starts breaking in such a way that things start having cascading problems, right? So one thing doesn't show up at one place, and then it doesn't end up on the truck that's supposed to go to the other place, and the whole system starts cracking. And so these disruptive incidents can have these major impacts.
So we're going to start to see more of these cyber like degenerates, and what I mean by that is the lack of moral compass. Like you said before, "Oh, we're
Yeah.
not monsters," but that's exactly what you are. When people, like I said, like money is money; it comes and goes, and we can give it back. But someone's life, like I mean, that this is getting into really extreme territory now. So they just don't care. Is it just well, like you said, people need hospitals to operate, so therefore it's easy to get money out of them. So what does that where does that leave us, like, as an industry, but also as a society that, like, people are now going to this level for money?
I think, well, one, I think it makes what we do 10 times more important, right? I think this isn't just about money anymore. Unfortunately, the nature of this activity is far more dangerous. There are plenty of unfortunately degenerates carrying out this activity now. They've gotten far more aggressive. We can see them threatening people's families on multiple occasions now. Unfortunately, because they recognize that they can essentially do anything until you pay them through cryptocurrency, it's only going to get worse, and we are going to have to continue to step in and fight that.
So what does worse look like in your eyes?
Well, okay, so it started off with ransomware, right? So I would disrupt your systems until you paid me directly, and somebody realized, well, people actually are more interested in their stuff being leaked, so they leak stuff until they pay you. But and then now increasingly we see people realize that they can just make threats until they pay. But I think it's kind of up to the adversary's imagination. What do they have to do to push your buttons until you pay? And I think, unfortunately, there's going to be some big surprises on how far they could, or how far they're going to take it, especially for actors who feel like they're above the law and not really concerned about retribution. And I could possibly imagine some of those things, but I'm afraid that there are going to be scenarios that we can't even think about.
So I remember a while ago I was talking to a cyber advisor. I mean, this was years ago, and he was sort of saying in his presentation, cybercrime is what the old crime used to be. So when obviously the internet started, it became more ubiquitous in the 90s. The crime went online. But would you sort of say, listening to what you're saying, now, if I were to go out there and literally physically get into someone's face, not that I ever would, but I'm just playing out a scenario, and say, give me the money, give me the money. That's a hell of a lot different to sitting in my home and doing something remotely and virtually because I'm not seeing these people, I'm not seeing their emotions. So would you say that whilst yes, of course crime's gone online because of the internet, etc. However, it's escalated because people aren't in front of people and seeing perhaps their emotion. Like you can't out of sight, out of mind, right? Like if I look up
Yeah.
10,000 credit card dealers, I don't know who John Smith is and his family and his life story, and maybe he's suffering from something mentally. Like when you're physically going up to someone and you're demanding that, that's a lot different. And there is some conscience there. Well, I like to hope so. But when you're doing it remote, like these people are just a number on a screen for you.
I think you're absolutely right. There's a psychological phenomenon here where people feel like they're not actually causing that much trouble, or right? And I can tell you, when you talk about like a lot of the criminals that we have seen historically in the past, they would always sort of carry themselves off or sort of talk about themselves as if they were not that, right? They would say, "Listen, we are business people. We are doing free penetration testing, or we're doing unannounced penetration testing or something along those lines. And you're insured, right?" And they would always sort of take a very like almost sort of friendly line to the whole thing, right? And I remember stories of conversations where something had gone wrong with a group, and they were actually apologetic. Unfortunately, though, I think that the the way that the dynamics of sort of being able to pay money directly to an adversary, though, means that somebody will come along who's not interested in all that civility, right? And we're going to drift in that direction. There'll always be somebody who, even though all these other actors said we wouldn't hit hospitals in that time frame, there was one actor we watched who was literally lining up dozens and dozens of hospitals for attack, to the point where we just couldn't believe it. It was shocking. There's always somebody who's willing to push that line. And unfortunately, that line sometimes gets pushed for everyone when somebody proves that it's possible, because this is like a marketplace, people follow.
So I want to talk about China. Now, it's a very controversial sort of area, but I think it's important now. And you would have heard on the news, obviously, the United States now is trying to beat them in the quantum game, the AI game, etc., because they're thinking, well, we've got to overpower them because if we don't, that weakens our position. So, talk to me a little bit more about what's going here. What do you know? What do you think people don't know about China? I'm keen to get into this one.
Sure. Yeah, they have been fielding a number of intrusion teams for several years now. They carry out this activity all across the world, but they have, for a very long time, carried out activity in Australia. Australia's government, critical infrastructure, defense industries, and multiple other industries have been historically targeted, and they are currently being targeted by a number of different actors. The big thing that has changed is that they're just a lot better than they used to be. They have invested and they have built out an ecosystem that gives them access to 0 days and cutting edge techniques and things like supply chain activity. And all those things are what we expect now, rather than the exception, which is what they were a long time ago.
And would you say China is better at covering their tracks now?
Oh, they're way better at covering their tracks. That's sort of the areas where they've really invested. A good example, if you looked at the activity, I started a million years ago working at the State Department doing this stuff. And when you looked at the activity back then, it was generally you get a spearfish. It was the worst written spearfish you've ever seen. The user would immediately recognize that something was wrong, right, and raise the alarm. Maybe they would click on it, maybe, but it was very rare. Once the actor got on the machine, they would use this terrible malware that was clunky and loud, and we were easy to find. And then they would call out. I kid you not. I remember them calling out directly to Shanghai, not even bothering to mask their command and control. What it looks like now is they instead of targeting with social engineering, more frequently they target the network edge. Ironically, they really like to target security products that sit on the network edge, because those products are very difficult to monitor. You cannot put most modern EDR solutions on the security devices sitting on their edge. It's sort of like you are defending an island and you can't watch the beaches. And so they get a beachhead really easily in a place where most of us can't see. And they move through the network, increasingly using living off the land techniques rather than malware. And then when they call out their command and control, instead of calling back to Shanghai or calling back to a VPN that they use again and again and again, we can see that, or the VPS they use again and again and again, we can see them using what we call these networks of compromised systems, compromised routers, small office, home office routers. So if they hit a target here in Sydney, it wouldn't be unusual for them to come through a home office router that's right down the street. They look like they're coming from really close by. They also consistently burn those routers. They don't use them for very long. And so any IP address that you might have, or might be a good piece of forensics data that you might use to find them is worthless pretty quickly because they burned it. We're not detecting them when the user sees the terrible spearfish. We're not detecting them because on the edge, because there's no detection capability. When they move across the network, they're using less and less malware, which means all of our malware detection capabilities, which have grown and become much better, are ineffectual. And then they call out to an IP address that we can't use for very long. And so they've gotten much, much more stealthy than they used to be. When the Volt Typhoon activity started being found in the United States, or started to be discovered in the United States, and is later discovered it here too, the question that people were constantly asking for is, give us the IOCs. And I think I was at a conference and somebody from the NSA said there are none. That's how advanced they've become.
Okay, so I have so many questions. Okay, so I want to zoom out for a moment. So now with the United States going in trying to overpower China, as I said, the AI and the quantum game, right? So depending on who you listen to, now I listen to people from all walks of life in terms of YouTube and podcasts. Just so hypothetically, China wins the arbitrary AI quantum game. What does that then mean for the United States? Because it's important because as an Australian, we are part of the Five Eyes sort of countries, right? There's an alliance, there's an allegiance there. What does that then mean, given everything that we've spoken about in terms of the threat landscape then?
I can tell you that AI is being used, already by threat actors, and but it's more importantly also being used in for security, right? So we're definitely in a period where we can see them sort of, I'd say, experimenting with AI. Most of that's in the social engineering space, right? So you would see a lot of like the content that they need for social engineering, like the fake email or the fake persona that sits on LinkedIn. Increasingly, we're seeing hints that they're using it in adversaries are using it in their malware. So rather than writing a hard coding a command into the malware, we saw an actor basically call out to an LLM and have the LLM build the command. That way it would always change and be harder to sort of track and look for. And we expect a lot of other advances along those lines too. But the good news is that, we're already leveraging this stuff to find malicious activity. The really cool thing that we did just the other day at Google, we had some minor evidence that an adversary was essentially staging a 0-day. We didn't know what we didn't know what the exploit was. We just had evidence that it was potentially in a certain type of software. And we used an AI tool to essentially uncover that 0-day. And then we were able to work to get a patch out before that adversary could field the 0-day. So, I mean, in the Intel space, that is wins like that are rare and as good as it gets, right? To actually beat the adversary before they can even field their malicious activity. There's a ton of real value that we can bring on the defensive side too.
So then I'm curious to understand what's North Korea's play then? What's going on with them?
North Korea is very interested in cash, right? So, they've always had cyber capabilities or cyber espionage capabilities. They've always done these disruptive and destructive attacks particularly in South Korea. What changed is that several years ago, we saw them basically start knocking over banks. They were doing these long-term heists in banks where it basically ended with them trying to wire themselves like $100 million, these huge incidents. And that led to a ton of different schemes for them to basically bring money back to the regime, most of which were focused on cryptocurrency. And, they would be like, for instance, they were hitting cryptocurrency exchanges, right? Or doing these massive supply chain incidents where they got that down to all kinds of targets. But what they're really looking for was crypto wallets, things like that. But one of the ways that we saw them sort of targeting the cryptocurrency industry was we could see them getting jobs at these places a few years ago. And increasingly we could see them taking jobs at all kinds of different companies. And mostly at first it's focused in South Korea and the United States, but since then it's happened everywhere. We know that it's happening in Australia as well. But we call it the IT worker problem. So what basically is happening is North Koreans are going out into the world and taking these remote IT positions at companies all over the world. For the most part, when they get these jobs, their goal is to just work them and keep them because they want that paycheck rolling in. And so it's not unusual to have one IT worker working multiple jobs simultaneously. And we've even been told in many occasions that they did a good job. They were competent, reliable workers. For the most part, the scheme is actually labor for money.
So, from my understanding, China and North Korea they get along. So, do you see them teaming up a lot more to go against United States and friends, or where do you sort of see this now escalating to?
I get those questions a lot, like not just for that, but Russia, Iran, and other sort of possible teaming up situations. But I'll tell you, for the most part, on the cyber side, these services are actually quite competitive with each other, and we can see on multiple occasions we've seen them target each other. So they have to collect on. They don't trust each other, I think, ultimately, right? And so when you don't trust your peers, you target them with your capability. And so we've seen all kinds of sort of strange ways that's played out. For instance, the Russians have set on top of an Iranian intrusion set where they basically hacked the Iranian intrusion set and then leveraged the Iranian set. They basically masqueraded as that set in some occasions, but sat on top of it and could see anything the Iranians were taking. So they basically let the Iranians do all the hacking for them. And then on one occasion, Russia carried out an attack and they tried to make it look like North Korea did it. It's very, very common to see actors from all of these countries target the other country in intrusions, usually against government organizations, because they want insight into what those countries are doing, just like they do everywhere else. I don't think there's just not a lot of trust when it comes to these capabilities. That's the good news. The bad news with North Korea is that they do some of this activity from China and many other countries where they're sort of allowed to operate out of. So these IT workers are not all based in Pyongyang. Some of them are in China and many other countries.
Okay, so there's so many questions I have. We are running out of time, but one question I do have for you is in terms of power. Power gives you a lot more capability to do things. So, given your experience, what country would you say at the moment, as in today, would have the most power in the cyber AI, even quantum game?
You mentioned the Five Eyes, right? And I think that's probably the best way to think about the group, or the U.S. and Australia. They're really a part of a really tight knit group, and they probably have the most power, cyber power. But there is a downside to that. That power comes directly from the fact that we are the most advanced and structurally complex economies in the world. And that also means that because we have all that power, we also have incredible vulnerability, right? We have a lot of critical infrastructure that is online. We have way more, way more complex systems that rely that could lead, when they go down, could lead to those cascading effects, right? And so the downside of cyber power in a lot of cases is cyber vulnerability. Story that I think about all the time is whenever I think there was an incident with Iran. This is several years ago, when the Pentagon basically took credit for, or it was reported the Pentagon had carried out some sort of hacking operation against Iran. What it's important to remember is that, when that happens to Iran doesn't target the Pentagon. That's not how they're going to respond. They're going to respond against oil and gas, or telecoms, or some other critical infrastructure target within the United States. Your offensive capability is not the same as your defensive capability. The Pentagon is not the target for most of these actors, right? In those cases, their targets are going to be critical infrastructure, which largely lies in private hands.
So, John, do you have any closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
If you talk to a lot of cybersecurity folks, they're worried that they sort of tend towards paint by numbers, right? And I think it's really important to do hygiene, right? And be brilliant in the basics. Absolutely important. But it's also really important to know who the adversary is. I'm a military veteran, and I was deployed as part of a situation where we weren't really designed for. The military that I deployed with wasn't really ready for the situation that we were deployed for, right? And we had to evolve. But it's important to know who your adversary is so that you can evolve, right? And if you're doing security without sort of recognizing who they are, you're just building walls, and the adversary could have planes, right? You have to think about who's coming and how they operate and move in that direction.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.